All right, so I have gotten your poetry project assignment project, not paper. It's going to be a PowerPoint, and thanks to my son, who is also a college student elsewhere, you don't have to do any actual being on screen for this. You're just going to submit it like a project, but you're going to submit it to the discussion board so your classmates can benefit from your research and you can benefit from your classmates' research. So what you're going to do is make a PowerPoint with a different slide, at least one, I guess, for each of the 5 P's of the poet, which we are thinking of the poet as a person, just an individual, the poet as a poet. So what is their poetic persona, which might be different from who they are in everyday life? So you have poets who aren't full-time poets for the most part in these early American writing days. And that's still true today, frankly. Poet as pedagogue, that might be a different word that you're not used to. And really, I was just looking for another P word to fit with the messages that the poet tends to convey through their poetry. Pedagogy is a method of teaching. So what is the poet teaching in his or her poetry? Also, you want to discuss the poet as a politician, which might seem strange. A poet doesn't seem to be a politician, but poets write about what they see around them. Usually it's about something small and personal. However, poets are usually using the personal and the very small, detailed description of a thing or an event to make a larger point about the world around them. And so the personal becomes political in that sense. So you might look at the political side as, who does the poet wish to see heard in this poem or their poems? Who does the poet think needs to be recognized not just as an individual but as a contributor to the larger idea of America and their contributions? Some poets write about the people that we know well. For example, Phyllis Wheatley writes about George Washington. So you may feel like that's the one you want to go with for the political, but it could be more along the lines of something very small and personal that is an issue for people who are not as famous and don't have the power. So consider that for the political too. And then we have poet as philosopher. So this could seem like it would be redundant with the whole pedagogue thing and what we're learning, what the message is, but I wanted to consider the role of philosophy is a little bit separate from that, especially because we have so many religious poets, at least early on. And I think there's still a thread of that even in the later poets if we look for it. So even if they may not express a particular formal kind of religion, what do they find that's important, that is a big influence on their lives? Oftentimes it's nature in the later poems, the later poets. But it could be other things. So look out for that. So for these 5 P's, you're going to have to do some of your own analysis, your own interpretation and thinking. I also encourage you to do research. However, I am really interested in how you can see things in the poems that everybody else in the world may not recognize. So you're going to explore these 5 ideas. You're also going to use one direct quote from at least one poem in each slide. So you can quote more than one poem if you feel like you need more evidence, but at least one. And you need to use at least 2 poems from the poet in the whole presentation. And hopefully that will be clear as you read through the assignment instructions. I do want you to do research, so use at least 4 sources in the whole thing and directly quote at least 2. That will happen because you have to cite a poem on each slide, but you can use the same 2 poems over and over again if you wish to. So you can pause and read this here, or you can print it out and read it. Here are the poets that you have to choose from. So I'll let you choose any of these poets, and I have listed a couple of poems for each. I would prefer that you stick with poems that are in our textbook, except for, of course, I have added a few more that I just happen to like, and I have included links for those. That these are poems that we will be expected to know for the edification and understanding that we wish to seek in early American literature, and of course for the tests. So I have included for you some details about MLA format because you're going to be expected to quote correctly using MLA format, and also you will be expected to do a bibliography, which is different from a works cited. It's going to be all of the sources that you use, whether you quote them or not. So definitely the 2 that you quote, and then all the other ones you use. You may need more than one slide for that. And I have an example title slide for you. This would be kind of an example of what you might have for your title slide. Do include a portrait, at least one portrait of the poet, and then in your other slides, something that relates to the theme that you're talking about might be good. Or, more pictures of the poet, also fine. Oh, I see that I need to make my title of my textbook italics. But I'm going to give you this sort of fill-in-the-blank version of what I'm looking for in each slide. I'm not doing it for each slide. I'm just getting you started with one. So when you start with the poet as a person, you want to, please don't leave name of poet in there. I have students who take advantage of my generosity and then just copy stuff without even reading. So please read and make sure that what you are writing makes sense. And if part of my template does not work with what you're trying to say, you are free to use whatever you need from this and ignore the other parts, but you should have at least this much kind of content and discussion in your slides. And I might, if I were to really write through this and quote things, I might need more than one slide for poet as person because I have a good chunk here and I have a lot of things that are just blanks. So you can see that I might need more space. And that's fine. You can use more than one slide if you need to for each of the 5 Ps. You just have to address each of the 5 Ps. So I'm showing you that I'm starting sort of with a main idea sentence in each paragraph or each of the 5 P slides, and then preparing you with some ideas about the themes that I'm going to be exploring in my content of the paragraphs or the slides. And then a good indication that I'm about to give you some details from an actual poem is when I use the phrase "for example." And then I give the title of the poem and I tell you what the poem is about. And then finally, way down here in the middle, I'm quoting. So don't start with quotations for any of your slides. Always start with some background and context. Actually, start with a main idea sentence, then give some background and context so that the reader is ready to read the direct quotation from the poem in a way that will make sense, in a way that helps prove the point that you're making. For example, you're pointing out a theme related to the poet as person here, or some imagery. And then after you've quoted from the poem, react to that. Explain what specific words maybe really express that theme that you're going for. If you don't feel like you have to do that, maybe restate the lines of the poem that you've quoted in your own words. You could say, in other words, the poet is saying, and then give a modern interpretation of those lines. That would be super helpful, especially in some of the early poems that we are studying, because some of the language is really archaic and it's hard to understand what it means. So that helps show that you understand what it means, and it will help your classmates understand better what it means when they go and look at your presentation. Sometimes students quote things and then they don't ever address them, and it makes it seem like they don't really know what they're quoting. They don't understand it, or they're just quoting things because they're required to quote things, and it's not connected to anything that they're talking about. So make sure that after you quote something, you address what you've quoted and say basically why it's important or what your interpretation is. Especially with poetry, we may interpret the same lines of a poem differently, and that's a good thing. That's what's cool about poetry. So with your research that you've done on this poet, you may have a better understanding than I do of these lines of the poem, because you have just spent a couple of weeks researching it. So don't be afraid to give your interpretation in your own words. The next part, after I have quoted lines of the poem, I'm showing you how I might use some information from the Norton Anthology, that those little bios before the poems are given in the textbook, those should be really helpful, and you can use those as research, and I expect you to. And then you may quote from that. So if you do so, you might want to quote and then put the page number it's on. And if you quote page numbers, it looks like this. So lines of poetry, you use the word lines. For page numbers, you just put the number. All right, and then of course, after I've quoted something, I want to react to it or show how it's connected to the rest of what I have been saying so far in the paragraph. Okay, and it's also a useful thing to show how the poet doesn't just represent himself or herself, but his or her community, and how that representation might still be something that we could trace throughout history or even today. So that's why I added those last sentences, to kind of give you some idea about how you might relate something that is old to something that's current. All right, let me know if you have questions. I'm sure you will. I will post responses and announcements so that you can all benefit from those answers.